Thank you very much. Tuesday this week I was dashing out to Hindhays Infant School where I was doing some work on labyrinths with the children there. And just as I was going, the radio was saying the Neolithic peoples introduced the worst disaster in the history of humanity. Unfortunately, because I was dashing out, I couldn't listen to the news item. And I was trying to myself, well, what happened in the Neolithic that could be so disastrous? And what I did, I got home in the evening, I went onto the websites and tried to find the news item, which I couldn't, but I did find some other interesting connections between the words disaster and Neolithic. One of them connects with the actual energy that it takes to produce food. And what was apparent that during the 200,000 years or so that we were hunter-gatherers and we foraged, that in fact this was quite a comfortable, relaxed lifestyle, and that the energy that it took to find food was actually very efficient. In the Neolithic, of course, the Great Revolution, still called by everybody the greatest revolution in the history of humanity, we invented farming. And you actually wonder why. Because if you ever make yourself an ard, as this is some sort of experimental archaeologist, and try and plough a field, and incidentally before you can plough the field you've got to cut down all the trees, burn away the stumps and dig forever, you begin to wonder why we bothered. What was it that was driving us to completely change our lifestyles? Are we better at it today? Are we better as a result of the Neolithic revolution for producing food? The answer actually is no. Today, in the petro-economic culture, it takes 10 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. Neolithic skeletons reveal some quite interesting things as well about how our lifestyles changed and how the balance between the genders changed. We know from examples of hunter-gatherer type communities around the world that they often show equal status for men and women. Some of them, in fact, are matriarchal. With the institution of agrarian economies, the role of women changes. And this is transparent in skeletons. This is obviously from the Egyptian context, but you can almost see what the skeletons are going to show. They show arthritis in the ankles, they show heavy arthritis in the knees, they show heavy arthritis in the hips. They reckon that to feed an average family of the age, a woman would be grinding wheat or barley with a saddle quern for something like 5 hours a day. So what was it? This is the mystery for me, and always has been in a sense. What was driving this strange change? Why, after 200,000 years, did this animal, this creature, the human being, Homo sapiens, decide to change the way they lived? And what a change it was. In the space of a few centuries, from living simply, nomadically, wandering from place to place, leaving virtually no trace behind of our activities, we're building huge and magnificent monuments such as this. We're going from a culture of small groups, small clans of 50 or so people, operating a sort of cyclic existence, going to the sea at certain seasons, going to the forest at other seasons, to the age of empire. It's worth bearing in mind, yes, we were building Stonehenge here, yes, we were building Newgrange, but in the Egyptian Neolithic, in the Egyptian Stone Age, they built the Great Pyramid. This was a tremendous change, and it's a change that happened very, very suddenly. Now, I'm going to be focusing on passage graves and looking at the sort of puzzles that they present. But first I need to say a little bit, in case you are not fully aware, of what a passage grave is and what makes it distinctive. This particular passage grave is on Anglesey, Brynkelladw, and what you see are the sort of classic configurations, surrounded by what are called curbstones, which retain the mound. There is a long passageway going into the core of the tomb, in which there is usually quite a spacious chamber. If we look at the plan, in this case the plan of Fornox in Ireland, you can see it's a very distinctive plan. You can recognise passage graves wherever you see them from this plan, that they have usually a small number, 3 transepted chambers in which the remains, for what they're worth, are found, and we'll talk more about that later on. You've got the distinctive passage going into this ceremonial area. The other thing that makes them distinctive is passage grave art. And this passage grave art, with very similar configurations, is found all the way from southern Spain to the northernmost parts of the British Isles. We've never managed to interpret this particular artwork. There have been people who have tried, but at the minute, the symbolism, the meaning of all of this remains quite a mystery to us. In terms of the distribution of this particular culture, you can see that basically what they've done is, quite obviously, they've come up through the Irish Sea. This is not this is quite a sophisticated culture, in the sense that these people are navigating, they're moving by sea, they're moving quite long distances by sea, they're clearly trading by sea. We know this because, of course, we get the trading of axes from all over Europe. In terms of their knowledge, their sense of geography, these people were already very sophisticated. And you can see that we get, this is why it's called the Boyne Valley culture, we get an accumulation of these peoples and of the architecture they left us on the east coast of Ireland. Now I need to say a little bit about their burial customs, because the curious thing is, I've called them tombs. It's common now to call them passage graves, but in fact the one other thing that characterizes most passage graves is the singular absence of human remains. Now, that is not to say the human remains aren't there, but they're there very often in ridiculously small quantities. I think it's fair to say that you could probably get the human remains that were found in Newgrange, one of the largest of the monuments, into a couple of matchboxes. That doesn't appear to have been the sort of significant function. And just so that we can be aware, the evidence would indicate, firstly, this is a Native American context, excarnation, which means putting the bodies out on a platform until they have largely rotted away. They were then gathered together, burned, reduced basically to a small number of flakes. And these flakes were then taken into the tomb in what appears to be single events. We're not talking about a funeral every time someone dies, every time someone important dies. We're talking about a single event in which these remains are taken into a tomb and sealed beneath the slab. Now, all of this says these are not really, their central function is not as a funeral monument. There is another purpose, but nonetheless, the presence of ancestral remains is an important part of whatever that purpose happens to be. Now, I seem to have got slightly ahead of myself here. This is the interior of Fornox, and this is just sort of another example of the architecture of that period. In my previous talk, I referred to the fact that the artwork itself appears to have some significance which is difficult to decipher. and that a number of archaeologists have speculated that the function of the artwork was in fact to create an altered state of consciousness. That's not the main theme of this talk, but once again, it's one of the questions that passage grave art raises. In no other kind of Neolithic architecture do you find this heavy presence of artwork. And this brings me to the theme of my talk, which basically is to try and decipher, to try and make sense of the presence of quartz in passage graves of the Boyne Valley culture. Because as I intend to demonstrate, in all of the tombs, the quartz is found, and it's found in very specific contexts. Now, I'm reminded of the very first time that I visited Newgrange, and in fact it was rather bizarre. It was quite late in the evening. I came across Dowth first, which is another huge passage grave, a mile and a half or so away from Newgrange. And looking across towards Newgrange, not long after that great wall of quartz was built, and watching the sun hit that face of quartz and the whole thing lighting up. And in fact, this was one of the qualities that no doubt would have inspired our Neolithic ancestors, that quartz has a kind of powerful and peculiar reflective quality. It captures the light of the sun. And I became quite interested in the whole use of quartz right from the very beginning. But I have to say that right from the very beginning as well, I was quite uncomfortable with the appearance of Newgrange. And perhaps that was something to do with the fact that as I was walking down the lanes towards Newgrange in the early days, long before the visitor centre was up, there were these signs that had been posted by local farmers, and the signs said, "No to Disney Grange." Because these people had lived with this monument all of their lives. And what they had witnessed since the early 1960s was this team of archaeologists going into the place and imposing, in a sense, a whole new interpretation on this monument. What all archaeologists agree, there is no disagreement on this one, is that that wall of quartz, at the most, would have survived a single generation. The pitch of the wall is so steep that it cannot survive. So why is it surviving today? Here's another example. As you can see, it's very steep, it's very sharp, but also note, at the back, there is this rather peculiar extending rim. And what we can see is that the archaeologists have cleared away what they called the cairn slip all the way around the front in order to produce this particular design. Here's a black and white photograph. You may not recognize this now, but this is in fact Newgrange. This is Newgrange in its reconstruction stage. And what you can see quite clearly, if I can get this thing to work, is this concrete wall, which is now the front of the tomb, to which the quartz is effectively glued and bolted. Now, I'm saying to myself, well, okay, it's taking all of 20th century technology to get that wall of quartz to stay up. They clearly didn't trust the quartz to stay up by itself when they rebuilt it, and the quartz wall became necessary. Now, if you are of a sensitive disposition, you might want to look away for the next slide. This is Knowth. This is the huge passage grave just down the road from Newgrange, under reconstruction when I first visited it. And as you can see, the point that was said earlier on in the talk about archaeologists appropriating these sites, doing what they want to do with them, imposing their interpretation on them, has some rather drastic and unfortunate consequences. And as you can see, the graceful slope that you will see at Knowth today, if you visit, beautiful passage, looks gorgeous. But at the end of the day, that graceful shape, as you can see, is sustained by reinforced concrete. When I visited, which was quite early on in its reconstruction, as you can see, I noticed that there were huge blocks of polystyrene lying around on site. And I innocently asked what the polystyrene was for. And they told me that the polystyrene was in fact going into the mound of Knowth, because they were a little bit concerned that after moving bulldozers over it all those times, that the chambers and the passage might collapse if they didn't take some of the weight of it. So when you visit it today and you see those graceful lines of turf, bear in mind that underneath it is concrete and steel and polystyrene. When the ideas for putting Stonehenge into a sort of new visitor context were discussed, some people euphemistically suggested that they could build a fake Stonehenge somewhere else and call it Foamhenge. In fact, that's what appears to have happened in the Irish context. So in a sense, what we have to do is go back and look at the archaeological record to try and make more sense of these sites. This may not look terribly clear to you, but I'll sort of try and indicate what this is about. This is the so-called cairn slip from Newgrange. And in fact, what it shows is that the slippage, in fact, is extremely even. It does not appear to have happened over a period of time. And in fact, if we look at this lower layer here, this is how they found the quartz. So they didn't find the quartz tumbled over a period of time. They didn't find the quartz in different contexts. They found the quartz layer on the ground right there at the very beginning of the monument's history, not on the wall. This revetment here was built in the 1870s. It's not a feature. The original monument as it was found, the slip so that the mound sort of moved evenly across that sort of distance. So there are issues. Professor Michael O'Kelly's sole evidence for the idea of the quartz wall was that underneath this stone here, no quartz was found. But it's a very thin piece of evidence. How to decide how steep it should be? Well, he experimented. He sort of worked out how steep he could possibly get it before it fell down. It was a sort of case of a little bit of crude experimental archaeology. So a number of archaeologists now have come to the conclusion that, in fact, the quartz wall that we see at Newgrange never was. So Newgrange, before it was excavated, the so-called romantic days of cattle and candlelight, and as you can see, this is already, of course, was altered in the Victorian period, this sort of gentle rising slope. But this means we need to think a little bit more carefully about how the quartz was used and why it was used not as a wall, not as decoration, but as a ring of quartz running round the base of the tomb. And in that context, it matches other contexts. If you visit the site, there's me, just want to prove I was there. You'll see, they may be gone now, this photograph's about sort of 15 years old, that there were in fact large quantities of quartz left. After they'd finished the reconstruction, there was still so much quartz that they didn't know what to do with it. And here you can see some of the quartz mixed with sort of river boulders. Now what's interesting is this took a lot of effort. The quartz was not available on site. The quartz came from 50 miles away, which means that the builders of Newgrange, most of the rest of the monument is locally sourced stone, but the quartz had to be carried 50 miles. You know, many, many, many tons of small stones. So clearly, quartz was very, very important to them. One context in which quartz was used was the entrance. The actual quartz layer itself, and this is how it's found, the layer was found around the entrance to the tomb, and it's around the entrances that we find the quartz. It's a kind of, if you like, almost like a container or a sealant for the actual entrances themselves. It wasn't just found lying loosely on the ground. The quartz was also found in specific pavements, and these pavements were often curbed. You can see some quite large stones around the edges. And this is different from that ceiling layer, if you like, that runs halfway around the tomb. These were specific pavements set around the entrances that clearly served some kind of ceremonial purpose. This is the famous roof box. I'm sure you're all aware. If not, I'll just say that, of course, what the roof box is famous for is at the midwinter solstice, as the sun rises, the rays of the sun enter through this box, travel down the passage, hit the floor of the tomb, and briefly, for 2 or 3 days of the year around the winter solstice, the interior of the tomb is brilliantly lit. That's just to remind us that whilst I'm talking about quartz, the celestial relationship of these tombs, the association with the stars and the moving sky, really cannot be doubted. Most of these monuments are aligned with important celestial events. But for my purpose, incidentally, the stuff to the either side is complete reconstruction. Even the archaeologists who did it will say that that stuff was never there. But the roof box was. And what's interesting is that the roof box itself was sealed with blocks of quartz. So once again, even though that's a sealant, it's something that's going to come out once a year, when the event was over, the quartz blocks, it was quartz that was used to seal the tomb. This is taking you back across to Knowth, as it now appears today. As you can see, the concrete reinforcement has disappeared under a nice, luxuriant layer of grass. But what they have done is also replaced all the quartz that they found at Knowth. And in this context, it's probably as it was at Newgrange. Surreptitiously this time, they've not tried to stick it back on the mound. They're accepting that it was a kind of sealing layer that was placed around the tomb itself. And again, I don't want to keep hammering this point, but for me it is important. When we talk about cairn slip, about tombs degrading over time, and that's why Newgrange lost its wall and it has this low profile now. No, this is Dowth. This is Dowth, a black and white photograph, but it's pretty much the same today. Look at the steepness of that profile, look at the stones, and as you can see, no cairn slip. The Neolithic builders knew what they were doing. They were very, very good at what they were doing. They were brilliant. And the changes that took place in Newgrange are to do with deliberate alteration, deliberate changes by the Neolithic people following its initial use and by later generations. This, incidentally, I just show this for romantic reasons. This is that view that I mentioned across from, this is the Dowth crater, as it's called. They tried to find another good archaeology for you here. In the 1840s, they used gunpowder to try and find the central tomb chamber. So this huge crater was literally blasted out of the heart of Dowth. In the distance, you can just see that white area there. This is that glorious effect that I witnessed. That's Newgrange. When the sun hits that, it completely lights up. But Dowth was blasted with gunpowder repeatedly, and it survived. So the idea of cairn slip, as I say, does not really hold water as far as Newgrange is concerned. Just again, just one more shot of Dow to show that you can sort of, if you choose to visit it today, the curbstones are all still in place too. This takes me, we're still in County Meath, we're still in Ireland, and this brings me to a place called Lough Crew, which has 70 or 80 passage graves over a stretch of hills. Very well worth a visit. The evidence for quartz here comes from late Victorian records. William Copeland Borlase visited the site. Sadly, for reasons which, in fact, I was discussing this with another speaker earlier on, the quartz seems to disappear. It walks. You know, tourists take it and all sorts of things. But what is quite clearly given in the archaeological record that here, again in this passage grave, we have quartz in very specific contexts. There was, again, a thick layer of quartz surrounding this particular monument. So quartz is found again. And the other thing that's referred to, which is something else that is found, was no longer there again, gone. But on the slopes at the entrance to this particular tomb was a quartz standing stone. So we also find quartz not just used as a ceiling layer, but also as a standing stone, usually associated with some celestial event again. But as I say, the standing stone here is gone, so we can't really talk about the specific purpose in terms of any orientation. Back to Bryn Celyn, which I mentioned earlier. And again, it was reading this a couple of years ago that made me sort of finally twig that something very specific was going on. Just reading a sort of book on archaeology in Anglesey and coming across a passage which said that Bryn Celyn was sealed with blocks of quartz, that the entrance was sealed with blocks of quartz. So we're finding exactly the same phenomenon happening again. Close to Bryn Celyn, sorry about the hazy photograph here, is a standing stone. Many years ago I went to visit because I was interested in alignments in those days and was fascinated by the fact that if you stand at this standing stone, which is a couple hundred metres away from Bryn Celyn, there is this peculiar mound in the way, which is natural but looks just like a passage grave because this rock is shaped like a passage grave. Beyond that is Bryn Celyn, and beyond that, at the summit of the Carnedi. So you get this fantastic alignment of similar shapes. But this stone, even though it's not a quartz pillar, when you look at it closely and look underneath all the lichens that sort of mucked it up, it's covered in quartz points. So once again, we have the context of a standing stone that's been chosen because it's covered in quartz, and obviously would have sort of glittered and refracted in the sunlight. And this comes to the other use that it's made of. This is another reconstructed tomb, Bar Cloddy Adi Goward, which is also on Anglesey. To be fair to the archaeologists who did this to it, there was no mound left. I mean, basically it was a pile of fallen stones. But what was interesting was, again, this reveals within the central area of the tomb was the remnants of a feast. And this particular feast remnant, again, is similar in all of the tomb contexts in which it's found. Here we find quartz used in a very different way. Here we find quartz fragments mixed with either human remains or, in this context, mixed with feasting. And what was interesting here was what they found mixed with the quartz fragments. It all sounds a little bit primitive, as you'll see. The stew, I'll read from the actual archaeological account, sealed by the layer of quartz, consisted of whiting, that's fish, eel, frog, toad, grass snake, mouse, shrew, and hare. Makes you think that whoever left that feast behind 5,000 years ago must have read the opening section of Macbeth. And again, to quote the chap who actually did the excavating, T.G.E. Powell, he says, it would not be proper for me to speculate about the ceremonial significance of such a stew, but I'm left with the impression that it was made to a recipe as elaborate and as rational as the brew of Macbeth's witches, which indeed it somewhat resembles in composition. But for me, what was important was clearly a ritual had taken place. And clearly whatever power was generated by that ritual or intended to be generated by that ritual was sealed, contained by a layer of quartz. And in most of the other contexts, you find exactly the same at Bryn Celydw. You find deep within Bryn Celydw the remains, fragmentary human remains, mixed with a layer of quartz. So, just to sort of summarize where we've arrived at so far, we find that quartz is used in these specific contexts as far as Neolithic tombs are concerned. Firstly, as a sealing material. At Newgrange, the original builders of Newgrange, I believe, did not put the quartz on the monument. They may have used a small amount for decorative purposes. They used it as a ring of white crystal to seal the entrances. That same ring at Knowth is found. There's two tombs in Knowth. There's one facing in either direction related to the spring and the winter equinoxes. You find that same ring of quartz sealing and containing. There are pavements, and all of these tombs have pavements, that is specific quartz settings apart from the sealing layer. A pavement of white quartz, clearly there for some kind of purpose. We find the quartz in small fragments, sealing either human remains or feasting remains within the context of the tomb. And we find it in some contexts, not all, as a standing stone, either inside the tomb itself or on the exterior of the tomb. So let's turn to quartz itself, because maybe we can sort of start to unravel this mystery by looking at the substance. Quartz is the most abundant, or one of the most abundant of crystals around the world. So it's something that our Neolithic ancestors would have been able to see. If any of you walk up Snowdon, as I try to do periodically, you see what looks like snow, but in fact it's layers of quartz extruding from the ground, because of course it's a hard substance and therefore the rock wears a way around it. But it has some very interesting qualities. Now this, believe it or not, is a radio. And it works as a radio without any electricity. This radio, crystal radio sets, which apparently people were making for themselves during the Depression in America when they couldn't afford radios, just requires a few domestic items. You don't need these bits because they're for tuning. So if you're just making a radio set for a local station, by experimenting with the length of wire you've got, you can make a radio. So all you need is to stick a piece of wire in the ground, have another piece of wire that goes into the ether to pick up the radio waves, and get yourself one of these earpieces. And you'll be able to pick up radio stations. Now the earpiece is what is interesting, because these are called crystal earpieces, and what they have in them is a flake of quartz. Quartz is one of the most energetic producers of electricity. So basically what happens is the electricity hits the piece of quartz, just the small amounts that are traveling in the form of radio waves through the ether, converts the electrical discharge, makes that piece of quartz vibrate, and the vibrating quartz creates the sound. Now you can try it out for yourself, as you say, that's all the technology there is to sort of with the more simple radios, which is why radio was invented way back in the 19th century. There was nothing massively complex about it, but it does raise some very, very interesting questions about how long ago? Has it been invented before? Has somebody else come across this peculiar phenomenon long before we did? Quartz has other fascinating functions. One of the main ones is that if you pass an electrical discharge through it, it vibrates at a very, very specific frequency, which is why most of us will be wearing a watch which contains a piece of quartz. Most of the timepieces in the world today require the use of quartz, and it's this particular quality which has meant that quartz, in fact, is used in thousands of different contexts in modern technology. Quartz, of course, is used also to generate quite powerful bursts of electricity. The piezoelectric effect of quartz means that if you bang a piece of quartz, compress it, you get an electrical discharge. Hence the fact that when you use one of these little lighters to light a gas fire, click, it's a piece of quartz that's been hit, and that produces the electrical discharge. Now, we know that ancient cultures around the world did use quartz. Sorry about the sort of rather stereotypical image of a shaman, but what we do know is that shamans around the world carry bags of quartz with them. You won't find a shaman, a shaman worth his salt that doesn't use quartz. Now, this is another thing which I find very interesting. Quartz rattles made by certain American tribes, filled with pieces of quartz. When you shake the quartz around, it in fact produces an electrical discharge which is visible in dark space, called a sort of mechanoluminescence. You can see there's a picture taken in the dark of mechanoluminescence. And these tribal peoples will sort of use these things at night. Now, you can just imagine how powerful an effect it would have been if you're in the darkness of a tomb in somewhere like Newgrange, you're shaking your rattle away, and you're actually releasing light, creating light out of these pieces of quartz. Aborigines make a phenomenal use of quartz. All of their rituals connected with making someone a shaman to do with driving quartz into the body. Some quite bloody ceremonies involved where the initiate is being rubbed hard with quartz crystals to sort of spiritually, if you like, drive the quartz into their body. They're made to drink a drink containing ground up quartz. Quartz is seen as the sort of energetic source of their power. And a lot of this is probably connected to the idea of creation, the idea of the rainbow serpent, because, of course, one of the things that quartz does as it refracts is to produce rainbow colours. This was the stone of the sun for the Celts. It is also the stone of the sky as far as the Aboriginal cultures are concerned. It comes from the sky. It contains the energy of celestial bodies. And finally, just to remind us that this idea of connecting quartz with the heavens and journeying to the heavens is symbolized by the rainbow. And one of the great things that quartz can do is to produce a sort of rainbow effects. So what I'm trying to say before I sort of come to my conclusions is that there were certain very powerful and unusual effects that would have been apparent to the Neolithic peoples. Its power to produce light, its power to produce a discharge of some strange energy, possibly, just possibly, used in certain contexts to create sound as well. Now, this brings me back to the context of the Neolithic tomb, and also what I said by way of introduction. Why, after countless generations, do we suddenly find, and it is sudden in the context of 200,000 years, the building of these vast monuments, the building of these vast containers, if you like. And I think what we have to do is to put together the idea of the shaman and the idea of the tomb. There is no doubt, because we can check this with numerous cultures around the world today, that quartz is regarded as a storehouse of energy within the shamanic hunter-gatherer context. So what we're seeing is the use of energy, the energy of the ancestors, the energy of the sky being writ large. How can we get more powerful? How can we control the elements? How can we control the skies? How can we control our enemies? What we need to do is to do what the shaman does, only do it much, much, much bigger. In a sense, what is happening is the prefiguring, and this brings me back to the concept of the disaster that I talked about at the beginning. Prefiguring the concept that bigger is better. If we can make it bigger, we can make it more powerful. We can control it. And I think this is what Newgrange is about, and all of these other monuments. They're powerhouses. But the message that lies behind Newgrange is what Michael O'Kelly says about its making. He says it took so much turf to make that mound that they would have had to strip miles of fields around. And there would have been ecological damage for generations as a result of the building of that monument. And in this whole idea of the search for power, the search for control, and the destruction that we wreak upon the planet in creating these vast monuments in order to achieve that control, we have the prefiguring of what we're doing to our world today. Thank you. Energy that it takes to produce food. And what was apparent that during the 200,000 years or so that we were hunter-gatherers and we foraged, that in fact this was quite a comfortable, relaxed lifestyle, and that the energy that it took to find food was actually very efficient. In the Neolithic, of course, the Great Revolution, still called by everybody the greatest revolution in the history of humanity, we invented farming. And you actually wonder why. Because if you ever make yourself an ard, as this is some sort of experimental archaeologist, and try and plough a field, and incidentally before you can plough the field you've got to cut down all the trees, burn away the stumps and dig forever, you begin to wonder why we bothered. What was it that was driving us to completely change our lifestyles? Are we better at it today? Are we better as a result of the Neolithic revolution for producing food? The answer actually is no. Today, in the petro-economic culture, it takes 10 calories of energy to produce 1 calorie of food. Neolithic skeletons reveal some quite interesting things as well about how our lifestyles changed and how the balance between the genders changed. We know from examples of hunter-gatherer type communities around the world that they often show equal status for men and women. Some of them, in fact, are matriarchal. With the institution of agrarian economies, the role of women changes. For a few centuries, from living simply, nomadically, wandering from place to place, leaving virtually no trace behind of our activities, we're building huge and magnificent monuments such as this. We're going from a culture of small groups, small clans of 50 or so people, operating a sort of cyclic existence, going to the sea at certain seasons, going to the forest at other seasons, to the age of empire. It's worth bearing in mind, yes, we were building Stonehenge here, yes, we were building Newgrange, but in the Egyptian Neolithic, in the Egyptian Stone Age, they built the Great Pyramid. This was a tremendous change, and it's a change that happened very, very suddenly. Now, thank you very much. Tuesday this week I was dashing out to Hindhays Infant School, where I was doing some work on labyrinths with the children there. And just as I was going, the radio was saying the Neolithic peoples introduced the worst disaster in the history of humanity. Unfortunately, because I was dashing out, I couldn't listen to the news item. And I was trying to myself, well, what happened in the Neolithic that could be so disastrous? And what I did, I got home in the evening, I went onto the websites and tried to find the news item, which I couldn't, but I did find some other interesting connections between the words disaster and Neolithic. One of them connects with the actual, and this is transparent in skeletons. This is obviously from the Egyptian context, but you can almost see what the skeletons are going to show. They show arthritis in the ankles, they show heavy arthritis in the knees, they show heavy arthritis in the hips. They reckon that to feed an average family of the age, a woman would be grinding wheat or barley with a saddle quern for something like 5 hours a day. So, what was it? This is the mystery for me, and always has been in a sense. What was driving this strange change? Why, after 200,000 years, did this animal, this creature, the human being, Homo sapiens, decide to change the way they lived? And what a change it was. In the space